So today, for Fix It Friday, for the 17th, we're going to take another look. Well, not another look. After... I get quite a few notifications. After last week, we discovered that when we do hair... So let's open up the hair and we'll go straight into this. Hair number 7. So when we do hair, we have to do it in a particular way in order to get it to work. Oh no, hang on. When we did it last week, we didn't get it to work because we didn't... That's right. So where's the thing from last week then? Open. Oh, so basically, so last week when we were looking at hair, what we'd done was used... So let's just hide this. Whoops, oh, we've hidden the wrong one. So hide that. What we'd done is used the head armature. So when we start the toolkit for accessories, so remember this is an animated hair accessory item. So when we start the toolkit for that, so we're using the attachment tool, we drop in the kit. So when we are selecting the initial armature, this is not what we use for the actual armature of our accessory. All this does is it acts as a proxy for the toolkit, so it knows what bone, what avatar bone is being represented. So this is representative of the head, there's the neck, neck 03, neck 02, neck 01, and so on. Each one of those is just represented by an armature that allows us to just make a selection and get the toolkit active and working. So what the toolkit is doing is using that armature as a proxy for what it then does, which is drop in the actual attachment armature. And that's the thing that we should be using. I just dropped a video tutorial on YouTube about this that shows the correct process. But Fix It Friday, so what we're doing today, just this Fix It Friday, is just recapping or correcting or updating that issue, that you need to make sure that you are using the accessory skeleton that gets dropped in. So if we just add a cube, doesn't matter for this, snap it to... Whoops, oh, well, can't do that, can we? Whoops. Cursor to selected, select it to cursor. Why did that go there? There we go. So when we drop in our object, let's just rescale that so we can see what we're doing. So that's our accessory, that's our object. So you don't necessarily have to mesh and complete the mesh into, whoops. Now what have we done? Oh, it's the layers. No. Whoops. There we go. You don't necessarily have to mesh the object. Oh, done it again. You don't necessarily have to mesh the object and get your hairpiece sorted out and then set up the structure of the accessory item. You can literally just drop in your base mesh object and click the... So we have to select, we're going to set the head bone. as our target. So we're using the mouse, the dropper, because it's easier than selecting from the list. Just click on our bone. So clicking on the bone, that sets it in place. So we're now, setting the bone as the head of the target, and that gives us the avatar. So we just hide that for now. So once we've got the initial stages set up, so we have our target bone, we can drop in our mesh. Again, it doesn't have to be completed, it just needs to be a mesh primitive that we're going to mesh our object from. Select our object and then just click on Set Up Mesh. And that will do what's needed to be done, and it's dropped in this additional armature that's occupying the exact same place as the head bone. So if we hide the head bone using the outliner, so we click on the little eye icon, we can hide that, and what we have left is this attachment.rig, and this is the one that we use to make the animated accessory skeleton. So with this, we now go into edit mode, and we can select our bones. If we have difficulty doing that because of the way that Blender's views work, we can use X-ray, and that sometimes works. If that doesn't work, use one of the different views. So if we go into wireframe, it turns everything into wireframe, and it just makes toggling through. So we're click selecting our, so there are two bones in exactly the same place, and it can be difficult to select them because of there's no difference between the two of them. So what you can do is just go into the different display modes, and that will assist selecting the bones. So once we've got this in place, we can then create our skeleton. You can use either bone, so we've got two. We've got attachment node square brackets head, and then we've got attachment root. Attachment root is the one that actually locks on to the head bone of the armature, not the armature, of the avatar. An attachment node is parented to the root node. I'm not quite sure why there are two bones, but you can use either or, so it doesn't really matter too much. But if you are animating, you want to avoid animating attachment root. So that means selecting attachment node. So if you have difficulty selecting, so we can either use the views, or in the outliner we need to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and we've got the armature. Just expand that, and there we have the two bones listed. So it's highlighting the one we've got selected at the moment, but you can click on either one to select them. Hey Tala, so you can use the outliner if you have difficulty, or just change the view. But once you've got that, so let's select that bone. As we have an armature already, all we need to do is just duplicate. So just click on that and it'll duplicate the bone that's selected. Whoops. So we can now, that's escape to reset it, and then we just move it into position. So depending on what you wanted to do, so that's duplicating the initial bone, and then we can also just extrude. So we'll use the extrude button, and then if we want to extrude in an orientation or direction other than the orientation indicated by the widget, so that's that yellow thing with a plus sign, we can click drag anywhere inside the white outline, and that will extrude in the direction that we've click dragged. So you then have to watch out for displacement. So when you do that, so undo those. When you do that, undo, undo. What you want to do, view menu, viewpoint, right or left, it doesn't really matter, so that so we're now in orthographic. So we've flattened the view so there's no perspective. So we are extruding the bones perpendicular to the scene. Yoink, yoink, yoink. So once we've got that, that is our animated accessory skeleton. And this is what we then have to weight paint. So let's go to object mode, switch our mode back, so we're in textured. Why is, oh, there we go. And it's this skeleton or armature that we then weight paint our object properly to. So at the moment, because we clicked on setup mesh and it's bound to the head bone, it's not actually to the head bone, but it's to the attachment node bone. So if you click on our mesh, go into object data properties, we now have a vertex group assigned to the mesh. So that means that when we go into weight paint mode, so click the armature, shift click the mesh, weight paint, that will turn red when which one is it? Attachment node. When that bone is selected, because this mesh has this vertex group assigned to it, it'll turn red. So that means it's got full influence. So once we've got that in place, we can then weight paint the rest of the mesh. So if we just do some quick editing to our mesh object, face select, just going to do some quick extrusion. Same again, view, just to make sure that we are extruding perpendicular to the scene. Let's rotate that. Whoops. Edge loop, rotate that. Let's go into wireframe. Whoops. Just do a bit of quick extruding, like so. And what this will reveal is that the entire mesh will be weight painted with this same group, so it is going to be red. So if we exit edit mode, object mode, armature, mesh, weight paint, it's red, completely red. So now we just select our bones, we select the bones, and we can correctly weight paint this object. Hi Sunny.
Hi.
We're just going over the hair accessory thing that we discussed last week, but correcting the record. So select that bone, weight paint. It's being recorded, so it'll be archived. And as we're doing this, we're getting new vertex groups added. I can't see. Hang on, let me just enable wireframe. This is a good idea to do so that you can see where the vertices are that you're supposed to be painting. Just enable wireframe so that you can see them. So that's that bone. That bone. And then we can leave this section red, but we need to get rid of the influence on the rest of the mesh. So we don't want this bone influencing these other areas of the mesh. So the easiest way to do that, or the quickest way, is to just drop back into edit mode. So select the mesh, edit mode. Just go into wireframe to make it easier to see. Whoops. Vertex select. So deselect all. So we want non-selected, and we want to use the vertex groups so that we can. So this is the original group, attachment node head. So if we select that and click the select button, it will highlight the entire mesh. So what we want to do is remove this group from these vertices. So all we need to do is just deselect the ones we want to keep, those ones, then just remove the rest of them from that group. So click that, it'll remove them, select none. So we can now double check that influence, and it's just selecting those. So if we go back into weight paint mode, so let's switch out of edit mode, armature mesh, weight paint. So now it's just selecting the bit that we want to keep. And just for tidiness, we can rearrange these. So the order of these at the moment is 04 is at the top, and 01 is at the bottom. So we can click on the up and down arrow. That will just reorganize the vertex groups in the list. So the selection is a bit more hierarchical. That now means we have an articulated, whoops, where's the in front? There we go. Select our armature, pose mode, we can now select our bones and it deforms the mesh properly. So this is what we wanted to do before, but missed. Because we used the wrong armature. So we have to make sure that we use setup mesh on the initial object that we drop in so that the proper attachment.rig appears in the scene, which is what we use. So with that, we can then animate. Whoops. So dope sheet, action editor. Always create your animations for IMVU using the action editor. And then one thing actually that we can do, which we did in the previous one, which also is useful. So armature select, pose mode. Select this bottom bone, or the bone at the end of the chain. Bone constraints, I think it's that one. Yeah. Bone constraints, and we want inverse kinematics. This is the thing that we couldn't find the last time we did this. Inverse kinematics, and at the moment the chain includes the attachment bone, these two. We want to exclude those, we don't want to move those. So what we want to do is set the chain length. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1 is the bone itself, 2 is the next one up, 3 next one after that, and then 4 next one after that. And this just then means that it's easier to pose our skeleton or our rig. So all we need to do for that, hey Caillou, so all we need to do for that is just, whoops, so once we're in the action editor, just move the scrubber, timeline scrubber to frame 1 and position the bone. So we're going to use the widgets, don't use scale, just move and rotate, select your bone and just move it. You need to select all the bones for an armature like this. So for an accessory you want to select all the bones, select all, and then once we're there, pose, where is it, animation, insert keyframe. So pose, animation, insert keyframe. This will give us a pop-up, and from this insert keyframe menu we want location and rotation. Don't use the one with scale, so don't use this one, use this one. That drops in a keyframe into the timeline, so if we expand summary we can see all the bones that are influenced by that. And if we want to see all the channels, so these channels represent an individual bone, if we want to see these all the time, just disable this feature and then we can see them all the time despite only one being selected. So it just makes it easier to see which ones have got animation data in them. So that's the first frame. Second frame, move that to the other side, and pose, animation, insert keyframe again. Whoops. Pose, insert, animation. So the shortcut key, if you're going to be doing this a lot, get used to the shortcut key. So that's the letter I for insert. Location, rotation, that's dropped in another keyframe. So this is why you have to make sure you select all of them. because we want to make sure that IMVU understands that there's animation data associated with the entire chain, not just the bone that we've manipulated. So in Blender, this works because Blender understands there's a connection between all of these. IMVU doesn't necessarily understand that. So we have to make sure that we select all and then insert the pose. And then for the return, we want to duplicate this pose. So make sure we've selected all. Pose, copy. So we're copying that data. Move the scrubber to frame 120. Pose, paste pose. And then insert keyframe. So what we now have is the first and the last frame are identical so that the animation loops. So if we press the space bar, it plays the sequence, but it's playing 250 frames, not 120, so we need to adjust that. So for that, we want to go into output properties. No, that's not that's render properties. That's output properties. That one, the one that looks like a printer. And we have some sequence data, not data, sequence properties. So we want to change end from 250 to 120. So click type. That shortens that highlighted area, so it's now at 120. And then we also, for IMVU, we want to change the frame rate. So 24 frames per second is the default. We want that to be 30. And that matches IMVU. So if we press the space bar now, this animation will speed up a little bit because it's got a couple of extra frames in from 24 to 30. But it'll also loop, and this gives us a much better representation of what the animation will do in IMVU. And that is our animated accessory. So what we can do is save this file, save as what are we? Yeah, it's Fix It Friday one. We're doing Fix It Friday. So now that we've done that, we need to save the file in order to export. All we need to do is just export. So let's exit pose mode, select none. So we've got our animation data. What we can also do actually is, before we do that, is just change the name of the sequence. So if we were doing lots of different animations, so in this case the hair had a different animation for standing, sitting, clapping, whatever, however many sequences there are, we can create new sequences by clicking the folder icon, but we can rename them. So let's just call this hair. Click type, and that's it. So let's save over that, save, then export. And all we need to do for that is make sure nothing is selected, and then just click the export button. IMVU will do, no IMVU, Blender will do its thing. We'll get this pop up saying it's successful. So now we should be able to get that animated into Studio. So we're in Studio, create new project, yoink. Now for this we need the accessory items. So accessory, female, accessory, empty female. So select, then derive. If you were using classic, you could still use the default accessory. I was just thinking it's not empty. You can still use the default accessory, but you've then just got to contend with replacing the default mesh, the shades, the glasses. Right, so import FBX. Find our file, fix it. There it is, fix it Friday 17th. Open. One thing we haven't done obviously with this is there is a basic material. Oh no, there isn't. So there are no materials, but there is, or should be, a UV map, which there is. So that's fine. So this, doing what we did, is okay for the purposes of testing. Obviously, once you've got your object set up and animated, you can then add a material and a texture. So we don't need to do anything here, so everything else is okay there. Next. See, so if there are no materials assigned to the object and no textures, we'll just get this default diffuse color thing popping in, which will be white or whatever the color is that's assigned to the mesh. Next. Attachment hair. So that's the armature, and there's our action sequence. It's 119 frames. Review. So that's what it's going to bring in. Import. So it'll auto assemble the mesh. Looks like a giant question mark. It's brought in all our bits. So we want to go into component, action, create new action. We want this to play all the time, so we want stance.idle for this. And then a new ensemble. And in the asset section, we should have our sequence. And there it is. So select, set the frame range, so frame 1 to 120, number of loops 0, replace, everything else is okay, apply, and then preview, and it should animate. And there it goes. So that is an animated hairpiece. So if you use the accessory, the way the FBX and the toolkit works, you don't necessarily have to set up all of this stuff, but in skeleton, root attachment, we can just shift this around. And it might reorientate itself relative to the orientation of the bone. Hi Jeremy. It might orientate itself relative to the bone that we are selecting. So let's go with left elbow. But it will still do what it's doing because, as we were saying in see, so it's upside down because the head bone points up, the elbow bone points down. So we go from clavicle, shoulder, upper bicep, hand, and then the fingers. So our mesh has reorientated itself. Let's see if we can just drop in a... It won't look nice. Oh, don't use TGA. Doesn't like those. Where are the JPEGs gone? Oh no, it's too big. Let's just use that. So we can see it more easily. So the object orientates itself relative to the bone. So if you were doing something that was not necessarily like a light would be okay. If you were doing an animated light that just moves around a, a path, you want to be aware of the orientation of the different bones. So as we're seeing, whoops, is that the wrong one? That's the wrong one. As we're seeing, our object reorientates itself, and the reorientation is done by attachment root. That's the anchor that latches onto the target, which is the actual avatar bone itself. So these are our proxies. So this bone orientates itself relative to whatever it's anchoring to. So if you were doing animated accessories just in a general sense, you were creating a general accessory that spun or did something like that rather than being specific to the head, make sure you account for the orientation of the bones, because like we're looking at, the head points up, these point out, that points up. But again, it depends on the pose as well. So it's not just the orientation of the bones, but the orientation of the bones relative to a pose. But that is what we should have done in last week's Fix It Friday. But we used the wrong skeleton. So make sure that you drop your mesh object in first, that you've set your target, so that's head in this case, and then click Setup Mesh, and that will drop in the actual accessory armature that will be used as the thing that latches onto the avatar in IMVU, from which we then actually make our armature that we animate. And that's what we should have done last week but didn't, because of the toolkit and the way that the toolkit works.
Oh.
Hey Ram.
Oh, there cat.
So yes, so that's that. I mean, if there are any questions about that specifically, you can either drop them in chat. So if you don't know where chat is, if you mouse over the heading IMVU do, if you move the mouse over that, you'll get a little highlight and there's a little chat, open chat icon. So you can type questions in there if you want. So that is setting up the rig for our animated hair and doing it properly, using the right rig or the correct rig. So let's just save as So there is a tutorial coming on these. It's to accompany the video that's already been released, but I've still got to sort out the assets and finish up the accompanying material that to match the material to match the tutorial. So the other issue, so switching topics, new general, so that's the toolkit. So new general, it's not related to the toolkit. Close that, no. Oh, it's going to poop. Blender doesn't like. There we go. There we are. Right, so the other question or the other issue that cropped up was asked about, Leafy asked about the shape key starter file. There's an issue with it. So shape key file, open. Didn't notice it before because we are facing front. So it's not visible from this angle, but the head is slightly off kilter. You can see it from the back. So the head is slightly off kilter. I'm not quite sure how that got into the file, but it's an easy fix. Make sure the timeline scrubber is at frame 0. Make sure the mesh is selected. We want to view the sidebar so that, well, you can actually do this in object properties as well, but sidebar or object properties. And what we want is the location coordinates. And all we need to do is click on X and just 0 that. So click type 0 and we can see the neck snaps into place. And we'll need to do it for the hair as well because that's slightly off kilter as well. So click on that, type 0, and that adjusts it. So you can then make your head or your shape key with the shape key file. Been a while since I've done one of these, but action editor, frame 2, new, there should be why isn't that dropping a that should be dropping a thingy. Oh no, it's not. It's in the, it's not editor, it's the shape key editor. So shape key editor, there we go. See, this is the problem when you don't do these things constantly. You forget. So that's right eye. So there we go. So now it's dropped a shape key, keyframe in. Then left eye. Swap those back. and that's your shape key sequence. So remember, depending on whatever, it doesn't matter what your animation is. So if you have your start frame as that, your end frame needs to be that as well. So we want, is it that one? No, it's not that one. Oh, that's why. And you might need to there we go, that's what I was looking for. Fish eyes. But if you do things like that with the shape keys, you have to remember to reset the controls on some of the poses. Depending on what you're doing, so that there is animation data in all the frames, because again, IMVU doesn't know what to do necessarily with these blank spots. So when you're doing a shape key animation, make sure that you have markers in each of the frames. So that might mean, so there's no actual data in this channel, in these two channels, so we want to put some data there, so there is some there. So when this is exported, I won't do an export for this, so when that's exported, there is data there that isn't overridden by the defaults, because any blank space is basically an opportunity for the defaults to pop through. So there needs to be data in your sequence, but that's that won't necessarily be affected by the neck being offset, because the shape keys are relative to what the face is doing, not what the head is doing relative to the body. That's a completely different thing. That's a proper mesh. So that's the clothing file. So whether you use the toolkit for that or the actual clothing, one of the clothing starter files, doesn't really matter. So that's how you sort that out. And that's pretty much it. Those are the main two things to cover this week. I mean, if there are any questions or if you need help with something, just share your screen or just drop a question in the chat. Oh, and so the starter files are IMVU starter files for Blender, and then just download. So these are the classic starter files, these are the updated ones. Then we've got the room and furniture starter files. So these are different to the toolkit, but they're a bit more flexible, but you do need to know what you're doing with them, because you're basically using Blender in its raw state, but just with an avatar representation. Whereas with the toolkit, it's dropping in the basics that you need to help with content production. So you don't need to be as well versed with the ins and outs of the avatars or the product types in order to use the toolkit. Where are we? There we go. And then there are also, whoops, starter files for Maya as well, but same thing. Right, so that's it pretty much for Fix It Friday this week. So yes, if there aren't any other questions, yeah, thanks very much for that, Mr. Car Driver. So if you were doing actually one thing we could do, let's just minimize that. You do pretty much the same thing with the, if you were using the accessory starter file. Where is it? Clothing, furniture. Oh, there we go. Female accessory. See, so you could do exactly the same thing. So this is what makes this is what we should have done. So when we were looking at the creating the animated starter file, so if we just hide the head and the hair and the classes and attachment rig for this one, so that's the head. So the toolkit accommodates the peculiar orientation. So in order for this to actually work in IMVU in its raw form like this in the starter files, we need to, the bone or the armatures need to point in particular orientations. But if you were using this to create your accessory, animated accessory, it's the same principle, but you don't need to go through that additional step of setting the bone, because the bone itself or the armature itself is the thing that you use, whoops, for your accessory item. Dagnit it. There we go. So we've got the same sort of bone names, attachment root and attachment node, and again we can see those in the outliner. So we've got the object is the armature object is called head, but within it we've got our two bones, attachment root and attachment node. So it's the same thing, you just extrude or duplicate your bone to create your animated armature. This time you can orientate your bones how you want them to be, but so long as this one is pointing in the right direction. So you don't want to adjust these if you are using the starter file rather than the toolkit. So don't change this. You can do whatever you want to these bones. So once you've got these, do exactly the same thing. Oops. Drop in your mesh. Let's drop to the feet of the avatar, and it's tiny because of the scale difference, so keep that in mind. So let's make this larger. Position it where we want it to be, and this time all we need to do, armature modifier, That's going to connect to our head armature. So the toolkit does all of this for you when we click the Setup Mesh button. But this way is more manual. It might be better if you're wanting to create complex animations, but you know, it's up to how confident you feel working with the starter file versus the toolkit. Because the starter file, the bones are all over the place, because this is actually a proper representation of what the avatar is doing. Whereas the toolkit compensates and uses proxies so that we're looking at something that makes sense. But you just basically then go through the same process once you've got that set up. So let's just do a quick bit of weight painting. So this mesh will now articulate with that bone that we've set in here, but not the others. So it obviously articulates with that because it's part of the chain. Whoops. But it moves on its own because of that bone. But, whoops, it's preference whether you use the accessory file or the toolkit, but they basically do the same thing. So yeah, that's it pretty much for Fix It Friday for the 17th. So if there aren't any other questions, I'll stop the stream, stop recording. And this will go up on the archive.